Welcome to Pastor Emilie's Story Hour. The story I'm going to read today is a short story by my own father, Doug Finn. My favorite stories of his when I was a very small child were his stories of Jerry the Giant and his search for Giant Land, or the Land of the Giants. But unfortunately for us now, my dad made those up out of his head as he went along and simply told us a new installment of the story every night, and he never wrote them down. But this one he wrote, and I remember asking him to read it all the time when I was very small. So here is The Haunting of Sam Tarver by Doug Finn. Sam wasn't really scared of the house, even though everybody said it was haunted and that the old woman who lived there was a haint. There was no such thing as a haint. Everybody knew that. He told himself this as he walked down the narrow, buggy road that led from the school to his home. It was a 5-mile walk that he made every day, but usually he was with his older brothers. Today he had stayed late after school to help the teacher, and then played around the creek after that, so by the time he started home he had to walk by himself in the murky darkness. It was a lonely walk for a 10-year-old boy. A stinging wind blew right through his coat, and the snow swirled around in front of him. He put his collar up, hunched his shoulders, and walked with his hands in his pockets. He was nervous and jumpy. The wind blew through dark oak trees on the side of the road, and they reached out and tried to grab him with their twisted arms and gnarled hands. "Ain't no such thing as a haint! Ain't no such thing as a haint!" he repeated over and over as he walked. Sam started to whistle, but it made too much noise. The house must be right up ahead. The old woman might be waiting for him. He tried to keep his feet from crunching on the road as he peered into the inky blackness ahead of him. His heart beat fast. "Ain't no such thing as a haint," he mumbled. "That you, Sam Tarver?" Sam jumped and looked around wildly. The voice came out of nowhere. It was a man's voice. The boy tried to control his frantic breathing. He wanted to run, but his feet wouldn't move. "You'd best come in out of the snow." This time it came from his left. A shadow stood by the side of the road, and behind it were 2 yellow lights framed square by windows. It was the house. He stared at it, and his legs shook so he could hardly stand. The shadow walked out into the road. "You'll never make it home in this snow. It's fixin' to blizzard. Come on into the house." Sam's heart pounded in his throat as the shadow took his arm and led him into the house. Sam stood in front of a big fireplace, and in the light, the shadow became an old man who sat in a chair and talked, smiling awkwardly. The man was big, with huge hands that lay limp in his lap as if they were too heavy to lift. He was friendly, and Sam's heart slowed down and he breathed easier. After a while, the man said, "You'd best come into the kitchen and have some supper now." He followed the old man into the kitchen and sat on a bench at a big wooden table. An old woman stood with her back to him, stirring something in a pot on an old wood stove. When she turned around, Sam's mouth fell open, and he stared at her bug-eyed. She was a haint. He knew she was a haint just by looking at her. She was old. Her skin was wrinkled like a dried, shriveled apple, and her gray hair was long and stringy. She had a huge snaggletooth that stuck out of the left side of her crooked mouth. A thin line of saliva ran down from the tooth to her bony chin. 3 big black moles made a triangle under her left eye, and her eyes were red and puffy. Sam shuddered. But as he ate his supper, the woman talked to him about school, his folks, and his brothers. By the time he finished his supper, Sam wasn't sure if she were a haint or not. The man got up and opened the back door to look out. "Still coming down thick," he said. "You'd best spend the night here. Your folks'll figure you stopped off somewheres. We got a pallet up in the loft you can sleep on." Sam stood by the fireplace for a while longer and talked to the man about the weather and how it affected the crops. The man seemed glad to have somebody to talk to who understood such things. When it was time for bed, they took the kerosene lantern into the kitchen, and Sam climbed up the ladder that stood next to the wood stove. He lay down in the loft between two pallets filled with down. It was just like the loft in his own house. Off to one side, 2 smoked hams hung from one rafter. Directly over his head, 5 big sausages had been curled into circles and nailed to another rafter. He felt warm and safe. But when they took the lantern away, the darkness fell over him like the lid of a coffin. It was pitch black. Outside, the wind blew in gusts, sometimes with loud hissing sounds, sometimes with a low, deep moan. From the other end of the loft came an irregular slap, 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 slap from a loose shingle. "Ain't no such thing as a haint, ain't no such thing as a haint," he whispered to himself, and trembled. Finally he slept, but it seemed as if it were only a few minutes. He woke up with a start. Yellow light shone up from the kitchen. It made a round spot of light on the roof above him that shimmered around the edges. He lay still, listening. It was quiet. Even the wind had settled down. Wait, somebody was whispering. He watched the light on the roof. It was dancing around. Then the whispering stopped, and there was a soft swish, 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 swish. Somebody was sharpening a razor. His heart thumped against his chest. He lay still, barely breathing. Then the swishing stopped, and somebody walked around quietly in the kitchen. Sam continued to stare at the light on the roof. There were no sounds at all now. Everything was deadly quiet. He waited. He relaxed a little. Then he froze. There was another sound. Feet shuffling around in the kitchen and breathing. Heavy, wheezy breathing as if somebody were dying. It was loud. Then it got soft, but the feet still shuffled and the light still danced on the roof. He lay between the pallets and shook. It had all been a trick. She was a haint. The house was haunted. They'd only been nice to him so they could get him up here to the loft. Suddenly, Sam's heart leaped into his throat, and he gasped. There was a shadow in the light. It was a head. A woman's head. It had long, scraggly hair, and sticking through the head, right where her mouth would be, was a knife as long as his arm. He groaned involuntarily, a nearly silent groan from deep inside him, and drew his knees up to his chest. The breathing was louder now, and more labored, and then somebody started climbing the ladder. His heart stopped. Maybe he was dead already. The shadow grew bigger and bigger. The breathing became louder and louder. She was almost to the top. Her scraggly gray hair came up slowly over the edge of the loft, then her whole head. Her mouth made an evil grin around a huge knife with a wide gray blade and a big black handle. She took the knife out of her mouth, and her lips curled back like a rabid dog. Her snaggletooth stuck out at him like a spike. Sam wanted to cover his eyes, but he couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. She raised the knife slowly over her head. The cold steel flashed for a split second in the yellow light as it fell toward him with a loud swishing sound. And then it was all over. She lopped off a big hunk of sausage. "You best be getting up now, Sam," she said, "if you want some breakfast." The end.